Hi and welcome to Tales from the GULAG. Today I'd like to talk about foreign fighters for ISIS who have been captured in Syria and Iraq and maybe elsewhere, who have realised that they have made a mistake and want to return home, particularly focused on Australia here. So today it's ex-ISIS fighters to forgive or not to forgive. Saul of Tarsus once made a big mistake. Full of enthusiasm for his religion, he approached the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem at the time, for authority to go around and round up Christians and have them put into prison for their faith. Only he found that he had made a mistake. He encountered the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus, became a Christian, and went on to become the apostle to the Gentiles and eventually author of much of the New Testament. But once he became a Christian, all was not necessarily smooth sailing for him. At first, he was greeted with plenty of scepticism from his fellow believers, and anybody can understand why. After all, anybody would be cautious of somebody who, just a short while ago, was keen to have them face prison and possible death, and now he claims to be one of them. What gives? But eventually their scepticism was overcome, and Saul of Tarsus, an enthusiastic persecutor of Christ and his followers, became Paul of Tarsus, one of Jesus' greatest promoters. How many Australians have gone over to fight for our enemies, the Islamic State? I have heard the figure 100 have been killed there. According to Bernard Gaynor, a former army major, speaking a few years ago, he said at the time that there were 2 Australian armed forces overseas, one of them fighting for our country and one fighting for our enemies. Back then he predicted that as the official Australian army was gradually withdrawn, particularly from Afghanistan, well, the other army, the other unofficial Australian army, would become the bigger one. On the 15th of March, the Daily Mail reported on Zera Duman, and I'm not sure about the pronunciation of that name. She was a Melbourne-born jihadi bride who went to Syria to fight for ISIS with her husband and her family. She told the Daily Mail at the time that the next time she set foot in Australia would be when Australia was a part of the Islamic State. Asked if she missed her family, she replied, "Well, I think you'll miss yours soon." But it seems in time that Allah must have decided that the Islamic State was not such a great idea, and so that group has been defeated. And now, what to do with the likes of Duman? She and her ilk are now playing at our heartstrings, saying that they made a big mistake and their children should be treated just like any other Aussie kid and be allowed to come home. Last night, I listened to some talkback radio on this issue, and there were many bleeding hearts claiming that these jihadis should be forgiven, that they actually deserve to be forgiven, and that Prime Minister Scott Morrison is a hypocrite because although he is a Christian, he is not exercising forgiveness or compassion here. So this would be a great time to reflect on the nature of Christian forgiveness. Point number 1 is to say that actually none of us deserves forgiveness. Jesus died for sinners, which is all of us, including me, and while we were still defying him. He did it, not because we deserved it, but because of his love and compassion. But that forgiveness is only for those who turn to him, who are sorry for their sins, and who put their trust in him as their saviour. Paul of Tarsus experienced that forgiveness and so became a follower of Jesus. His life turned around. Christians are taught to be a forgiving people. We are taught to forgive as we ourselves have been forgiven. But that doesn't mean that we are necessarily shielded from the earthly consequences of our actions. Pick a sin. Drink too much, smoke too much, eat too much, fornicate. We may well forgive them. God promises to forgive them, but they may still get sick because of their actions. A murderer may be forgiven, but he may still have to face the time for his crime. But what about the apology? Paul realised his mistake because he realised he was wrong, and Jesus was indeed Lord. But what about these jihadis? Are they sorry because they realise that Allah does not exist and that Muhammad was no prophet after all? Or was it that, oops, they lost the war and they are now stuck in a refugee camp, and now suddenly their home country, Australia, suddenly looks attractive? Oh, but they are so afraid. They were fine to have their victims live in fear, the Christians and the Yazidis, that they have gone overseas to terrorise, or those whom they considered not to be Muslim enough. That was fine. But of course, God can forgive, and so can we. We are taught to forgive as Christians. It is, in fact, a wonderful thing to hear of ex-terrorists who have come to faith in Jesus Christ and are now standing up for him. Yep, they do exist, and it's wonderful evidence of the great things that God is capable of doing. But how do we tell? Paul overcame the scepticism of his fellow Christians when those that ministered to him testified that his conversion was the real deal. But their fears would have finally been laid to rest as the death threats from his former mates in the Sanhedrin came rolling in, when he faced some beatings and imprisonment. These jihadis that now want to come back, these people were not only radicalised on the internet, the evidence that I see is that they were also radicalised at the local mosque. If we are to entertain the idea that they can come home, it makes no sense to let them or their children go back to be radicalised in their same mosques, especially their children, only to have them continue there as jihadis at home. If we were to entertain the idea of letting them come back, I would insist that they show evidence that they realise their mistake and not just their defeat in battle. So maybe, for the sake of discussion, here are some of the credentials that I would look for. Maybe acknowledge publicly that the Allah does not exist and that Muhammad was not a prophet. Maybe they should acknowledge publicly that Jesus Christ is Lord and be baptised into his name. And then as the death threats come rolling in from their former mates, then maybe we might have some basis to allow them to come home without worrying about their religious war being brought back home. Or maybe what about an apology to their former victims? What about moving into a Christian village, apologising to them and maybe helping them to rebuild their homes? No, I'm with Scott Morrison on this one. Compassion without wisdom is just stupidity. What about justice for those that they have victimised? Is it not caring about the security of your fellow citizens compassion too? Even more, it is the responsibility of those in government to protect the security of their country and its citizens. Yep, I can forgive. And indeed, I hope that they also come to faith in Jesus and they also experience his forgiveness. And you know, maybe it'd be a great idea for us and my fellow Christians to pray that this would happen for them. But meanwhile, they chose their side. They chose Islam because they wanted Sharia. Now they can have more Sharia than they can poke a stick at. Let them enjoy it.